Okay, so I'm going to give you guys a little bit of the basic background of the Book of Acts, and basically we're just going to cover the basic stuff like who is the author, who is it written to, or what type of book was Acts, including some of the historical setting, and then the hermeneutics of Acts, basically like how do you interpret it, how do you read it, what are we supposed to be looking for there, and that's basically it. So let's get started. First of all, who is the author of the book of Acts? Well, the book of Acts does not actually say who the author was. It doesn't say in it anywhere. We do know, however, that the book of Acts is related to Luke because the style is very similar. A lot of the concerns are the same, a lot of the themes are the same, and the Greek is very similar. But from the early church fathers, these are like basically the church leaders who lived maybe 100 to 200 years after the time of Jesus. They all said that this guy named Luke was the author of the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel or the book of Acts. So that's why we think that the author is Luke. There's no real reason not to think it's Luke. It jives pretty well. Luke was considered highly educated, and he was Greek, and the language in Acts sounds pretty highly educated, and it's native Greek. It's not. It's They could tell that it's some of the best Greek in the New Testament. So it's not written by someone who has Greek as a second language. So that fits with Luke. There's very few Aramaic or Hebrew words used in Luke Acts. And also in the second half of the book of Acts, it switches from third person to kind of a second or first person when it starts to say, oh, we did this, we did that. So you'll see at first it says Paul did this, Peter did this, blah, 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 blah. The church did this. And then all of a sudden it says, we did this, we did that, we did this. So it kind of shows that it might have been a companion of Paul who wrote the book of Acts. And Luke, we know, was a companion of the book of Paul from Paul's letters. So that's who the author is. Let's move on to who was Acts written to. Now, in the first verse of the book of Acts, it says that the author of Acts was the recipient of the book of Acts was Theophilus. And in the beginning of the Gospel of Luke, it also says he was writing to Theophilus. So who is Theophilus? Well, we don't really know who Theophilus was. From the context, we kind of know a couple things, and there's some inferences that we can make. He probably was some sort of recent convert to Christianity, because the book of Acts and Luke also explain a lot of like kind of basic Christian things. So it's the recipient seems like he is a Christian, but doesn't know that much about Christianity. So Luke is explaining a lot of things. It's also Theophilus probably had some relationship to Judaism, or knew about Judaism, or was at least very curious about Judaism, because the book of Acts explains a lot about Judaism. So if you're a Jew, you wouldn't need Judaism to be explained to you, or ancient Jewish religion to be explained to you. But if you didn't care about Jewish religion, then you wouldn't want it explained to you. So the fact that he explains a lot about Jewish religion shows that it's someone who is not Jewish probably, but at the same time is very interested, or it has some relationship to Judaism. So that's basically what we know about Theophilus from the book of Acts. We also know that Theophilus, or we also think that Theophilus was probably what would be called a patron of Luke. And the reason why we know that is because Luke wrote in a certain style, and within that style, usually you would have a rich person sponsor your writing. So he wrote Greek history, and most Greek history had some sort of sponsor. So the fact that Luke was writing to this person named Theophilus really fits in well with that. That Luke sponsor was probably Theophilus. So that would make Theophilus more wealthy, more highly educated. And the reason why they would need a sponsor is because to pay for the ink, to pay for the parchment or the scroll that they wrote on was actually pretty expensive, and it takes actually a long time to make sure you write down everything correctly. So they would pay for the person to write it, they would pay for the materials, and it's actually a very expensive project, and only really extremely rich people could afford it. So and that's one of the things that rich people did with their money, is they paid for the things like this, for their own education and their own entertainment. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is what is genre, what genre or what type of book is Acts. Now, the type of book Acts is that it is history. It's a history book. But it's not the same type of history book that you would find in like Barnes and Noble in the history section, or that you would study in college history class or high school history class. Our modern history is a lot more, tries to be unbiased and talks mostly about the events of what's happening, and doesn't really try to convince people of different things or agendas or whatever. But Greek history, ancient Greek history, always had an agenda. It always had a purpose for being written, a persuasive purpose, typically. For example, the history about Julius Caesar, the main reason why we know things about Julius Caesar is because, like, we know he crossed the Rubicon, we know he fought these wars, the Gallic Wars or whatever. The reason why we even know that is because there's one person who wrote all that stuff down in the histories of Julius Caesar, and that person was Julius Caesar himself, right? So he wrote about what he did. So obviously it's very biased, and obviously it also has a convincing component. He wants to convince people that he was an awesome leader. So that's why he wrote those things. The same is true for Luke Acts. It's not an unbiased history. It has a persuasive or rhetorical component, and what rhetorical means is it's persuasive and uses certain language to try to persuade you. So when we read the book of Acts, we need to keep that in mind. And we don't want to hold Acts to certain modern history standards. Like, why is this book so biased? Or why did they not have precise chronology here? Or that type of thing. It's because that's not what was done in ancient Greek histories. Okay? So finally, the last thing we want to talk about is the hermeneutics of Acts, or how do we want to read it. So one of the things about Acts is that the book of Acts was written to a patron. Like I said before, it was written to Theophilus, and he would have, even though he was highly educated and could read it himself, what they would do is they would have someone else read it to him, like during dinner or after dinner, as kind of like his after dinner TV or whatever. So it would be educational, yes, but also entertaining. And so the person reading it would perform it a little bit. There'll be a little bit of dramatic interpretation of Acts, and then therefore the speeches are also very important because they're written in that way to be highly rhetorical. And so it's not supposed to be studied like, okay, 1 week we study this chapter 1, next week we study it. No, he probably sat there and heard it himself in 1 or 2 sittings. So it's not and it wasn't like, okay, he didn't study it to get application out of it. So he just took it in and allowed himself to be impacted by it, that type of thing. So when Luke is writing it, he has this in mind, and he's writing it for that style. So when we read Acts, what we want to be careful of trying to find, like if you're saying, I want an application this week, and you read chapter 1, what is the application? Certainly there are applications that you can find after chapter 1, but it's not really meant to be read that way. So you need to keep that in mind. Like, the entire book of Acts certainly has some applications you can take out of it. But generally, it's like the entire book of Acts might have 2 or 3 big themes that Luke is trying to convey. He's not going to have 28 different little things for you to learn. So when we study the book of Acts, we want to make sure we know that first. We want to take in the performative impact. So he's trying to impact you with a story, with some emotion. And if we just study it without any like emotion, without like using your imagination and stepping into the story, then we're not hearing it the same way Theophilus would have. Theophilus was hearing it like it was his TV, like it was like he's getting into it, that type of thing. That's how he would have heard it. So when we read it, we can study it, we can be very academic and intellectual about it, certainly. But we need to do that with the emotional, imaginative portion also, keeping that in mind. So when we read Acts, we need to look at that and read it that way. So another thing about this is that some, like in the Bible studies, a lot of the applications may be similar. And that's fine. That's actually good because that's the way it was meant to be read. And a lot of the applications, sometimes it'll be like, okay, start thinking about witnessing in chapter 1. But we're going to continue talking about witnessing in different angles of it or whatever in chapter 3, chapter 4, and on and on and on. And then we'll see more and more and get in depth about the gospel, different things like that. But it's like, if after chapter 1, you're like, okay, the application is I need to witness to so-and-so and so-and-so. After the second study, your application may still be the same thing, which is fine. You need to continue thinking about that and wrestling with that and working through that. And I think that's very important in how we read Acts. Okay, so that's basically some of the just very basic intro things about Acts. If you guys have any questions about that, email me, contact me. I can give you more books, resources, talk to you about Acts in general, whatever. All right.